In the gilded heart of 1888 London, where a young woman's worth was measured by her dowry and the title of the man she might someday marry, a forgotten girl named Aria Vance was about to defy every rule. An orphan, a shadow in her own cousin's grand home, she was deemed utterly invisible. But for one night, cloaked in the silken whisper of a borrowed gown that held more secrets than she knew, she would step into a world of dazzling chandeliers and calculating eyes. She sought only a single, stolen glimpse of a life she could never have. She never imagined that her quiet presence would capture the gaze of the one man no woman could claim, the powerful, unattainable Duke of Beaumont, setting in motion a scandal that would shatter the very foundations of high society. The Ainsworth townhouse on Grosvenor Square was a monument to new money, a lavish confection of marble, gilt and suffocating velvet. For Aria Vance, it was a beautifully furnished prison. Since the death of her parents 5 years prior, she had lived here as the poor relation, a ward of her uncle, Lord Ainsworth, and a constant, unwelcome reminder of his wife's less fortunate sister. Her existence was one of quiet servitude, her days dictated by the whims of her cousin, Lady Beatrice Ainsworth. Aria was the shadow that followed Beatrice's blinding light. Where Beatrice was celebrated for her fiery hair and sharp, fashionable wit, Aria was possessed of a quieter beauty, a gentle face, intelligent grey eyes that saw too much, and a mane of soft brown hair she usually kept pinned in a severe bun. She fetched Beatrice's shawls, endured her cousin's biting remarks about her dowryless state, and mended the fine lace-on gowns she herself would never be permitted to wear. The entire household was in a state of frenzied anticipation for the social event of the season, the Duke of Beaumont's annual ball. Duke David Beaumont was the most eligible and most elusive bachelor in all of England. He was impossibly wealthy, possessor of a title that stretched back centuries, and devastatingly handsome, with a reputation for being cold, aloof, and utterly unimpressed by the débutantes paraded before him each year. To catch his eye was to win the ultimate prize. "He will notice me this year, I am certain of it," Beatrice declared, preening before a full-length mirror as Aria knelt at her feet, adjusting the hem of a spectacular new gown of emerald silk. This gown cost father a fortune. It is the colour of envy, is it not? Every other woman in that ballroom will be green with it when the Duke asks for my hand to dance. Aria murmured her agreement, her fingers carefully working the delicate fabric. "It is a magnificent colour on you, cousin." "Of course it is," Beatrice snapped, her good mood already souring. "Now, see that my dancing slippers are polished to a mirror shine. And my mother has a list of errands for you to run this evening, during the ball. An important package must be delivered to her solicitor in Bloomsbury. It will keep you occupied." The cruelty was casual, but it struck Aria like a physical blow. To be sent out into the London night on a menial errand, while the rest of their world danced under crystal chandeliers, was a calculated humiliation. "Yes, Beatrice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She rose to her feet, her gaze falling on her own reflection in the mirror behind her cousin. She saw a pale, tired girl in a drab grey frock, her shoulders slumped in resignation. For a fleeting moment, a spark of rebellion flickered within her. What would it be like, just once, to be the one admired? To wear a beautiful gown and feel the thrill of a waltz? Later that evening, as the Ainsworths departed in their gleaming carriage, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and condescension in their wake, Aria was left in the echoing silence of the grand house. Mrs. Gable, the stout, kind-hearted housekeeper, who had a soft spot for the orphaned girl, found her in the library, staring blankly at a page in a book she wasn't reading. "Now then, none of that, my dear," the housekeeper said, her voice a comforting rumble. "It's a crime, what they do to you. A true crime." Arya forced a small smile. "It is my lot, Mrs. Gable. I am grateful for the roof over my head." Mrs. Gable snorted, a sound of profound disapproval. "Gratitude doesn't warm a cold heart. Your mother, Lady Annalise, would be turning in her grave to see you treated so. She was a lady. A true one. Not like these peacocks." The housekeeper's eyes suddenly lit with a familiar, mischievous glint. "Come with me, child." She led Arya up the servants' stairs to a small, dusty attic room where old trunks were stored. From a large cedar chest, she lifted a dress bag, old and faded, but carefully preserved. "Your mother left this with me for safekeeping before she told me it was her most treasured possession." With trembling hands, Arya unfastened the bag. Inside lay a gown of the most exquisite midnight blue silk. It was not in the current style, with its simpler lines and more modest décolletage, but its craftsmanship was undeniable. The fabric seemed to drink the dim light of the lantern, and tiny, almost invisible silver threads were embroidered along the bodice, forming a pattern like constellations in a night sky. It was breathtaking. It was hers, Arya whispered, touching the cool silk with a reverence she had never felt for any of Beatrice's garish confections. "It was," Mrs. Gable confirmed. "It is a borrowed gown, in a way. Borrowed from the past, from a happier time, and tonight I think it is time it was worn again." A wild, impossible idea began to form in Arya's mind. "But I cannot. The errand... Beatrice..." "The errand can be managed by one of the footmen," Mrs. Gable said, with a dismissive wave of her hand. "And Lady Beatrice need never know. You will go, child. You will have just 1 hour. 1 hour to see the lights and hear the music. You deserve that much. You deserve to feel like the lady your mother raised you to be." A war raged within Arya. The years of ingrained obedience fought against a sudden, desperate yearning for a single moment of freedom. The dress felt like a promise, a link to the mother she barely remembered. She looked at her reflection in a shard of a broken mirror leaning against the wall. The girl in the grey dress was a ghost, but perhaps, just for an hour, the woman in the blue gown could be real. "All right," Arya said, her voice firming with a resolve that surprised even herself. Just for an hour. The journey to Beaumont House in a hired cab was a blur of nervous anticipation. With her hair artfully arranged by Mrs. Gable in a soft chignon, and her mother's simple pearl earrings her only adornment, Arya felt like a changeling. The midnight blue gown fit her as if it were made for her, its understated elegance a stark contrast to the flamboyant fashions of the day. It was her armor and her disguise. She carried no invitation, but Mrs. Gable had pressed a crisp £5 note into the driver's hand and instructed him to use the less conspicuous side entrance, a gamble that paid off as a harried footman waved them through without a second glance. Stepping into the Beaumont House ballroom was like stepping into another universe. The sheer scale of it was dizzying. Hundreds of candles blazed in colossal crystal chandeliers, their light refracting into 1,000,000 diamond-bright shards that danced across the polished marble floor. The air hummed with the symphony of a full orchestra, the murmur of 100 conversations, and the rustle of silk and satin. Jewels glittered on necks and wrists, and the scent of expensive perfume and beeswax hung heavy in the air. Arya felt a wave of vertigo. She was a sparrow who had accidentally flown into a cage of peacocks. Every woman seemed impossibly beautiful, every man impossibly confident. She saw Beatrice across the room, holding court near a marble pillar, her emerald dress as loud and demanding as her laughter. A knot of fear tightened in Arya's stomach, and she quickly retreated into the shadow of a potted palm, content to simply be an observer. Duke David Beaumont stood on a shallow dais at the far end of the ballroom, a position that afforded him a commanding view of the proceedings. He was performing his duty as host, a faint, polite smile fixed on his face, but his dark eyes were cool and discerning. He'd endured 3 hours of fawning mothers, simpering daughters, and calculating fathers. They all saw him not as a man, but as a title, a collection of estates, a key to social supremacy. He was bored to the point of exhaustion. His friend, Lord Frederick Hayes, sidled up to him, a glass of champagne in hand. "You look as though you're contemplating which of your guests to have thrown in the tower, David. Do try to look as if you're enjoying your own ball." David's lips tightened. "I'm surveying the battlefield, Frederick, and I see the same troops as last year, just with new uniforms." His gaze swept disdainfully over the crowd, the overeager debutantes, the preening dandies, the gossiping dowagers. It was a tedious, predictable pageant. And then he saw her. She was half hidden by a monstrous fern, as if trying to merge with the shadows. She wasn't dripping with diamonds, or swathed in the garish colours that were all the rage. She was dressed in a simple dark blue gown that seemed to absorb the candlelight, making her stand out by virtue of her very subtlety. She wasn't scanning the room for potential suitors or trying to catch his eye. Instead, her head was tilted slightly, her expression one of pure, unadulterated awe as she watched the dancers swirl across the floor. There was an intelligence in her quiet observation, a stillness that was more captivating than any practiced coquetry he had ever witnessed. "Who?" David said, his voice a low murmur. "Is that?" Frederick followed his gaze. "Where?" "By the fern. I have no idea. I've never seen her before. Probably the daughter of some country baron trying her luck in the city. A bit plain, isn't she?" "She is not plain," David countered, his voice sharp. "She is authentic." Ignoring Frederick's surprised chuckle, the Duke descended from the dais. He moved with a purpose that parted the sea of guests before him. As he approached, Arya finally seemed to sense she was being watched. Her gaze lifted, and her grey eyes met his across the crowded room. For a heart-stopping moment, the noise of the ballroom faded away. She looked startled, like a deer caught in the beam of a lantern. He stopped before her, offering a slight, formal bow. "I do not believe we have had the pleasure of an introduction. I am Beaumont." Arya's heart hammered against her ribs. The Duke of Beaumont. The man Beatrice was so desperate to ensnare was standing right in front of her. She curtsied, her movement graceful despite her shock. "Miss Vance, Your Grace." She omitted her first name, hoping the anonymity would protect her. "Miss Vance?" he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue as if he were testing its weight. "You seem to be admiring the architecture more than the company." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "The architecture is perhaps more honest, Your Grace. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is, grand and intimidating." David was taken aback. No debutante had ever said anything so direct, so unscripted to him. They giggled, they flattered, they blushed. They did not offer philosophical observations on his ballroom. "An astute analysis," he said, a real smile finally breaking through his cool facade. "And what is your opinion of the company?" Arya's courage faltered slightly. She glanced towards Beatrice's group. "I believe the company is exactly what one would expect, Your Grace." He understood her meaning perfectly. He saw the flicker of her eyes towards the corner where Lady Beatrice Ainsworth was now staring daggers at them, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "I find myself weary of what is expected," David confessed, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. He gestured towards the French doors leading to the terrace. "Would you allow me to show you a piece of architecture that is far less intimidating? The night air might be a welcome reprieve." It was a scandalous suggestion to leave the ballroom with an unchaperoned young woman he had only just met. But Arya, caught in the pull of his intense gaze and the thrill of this impossible night, found herself nodding. Her 1 hour was ticking away, and she wanted to live every second of it. She allowed him to place her hand on his arm, and together they walked away from the prying eyes of the ballroom, leaving a trail of shocked whispers and one incandescently furious cousin in their wake. The terrace was a sanctuary of cool marble and quiet moonlight. The clamour of the ballroom softened to a distant, melodic hum, and the night air was crisp and clean. 1,000 stars were scattered across the indigo sky, a far grander ceiling than the one inside. For a few minutes they stood in a comfortable silence, a silent acknowledgement that words were not immediately necessary. "So, Miss Vance," David began, turning to lean against the balustrade beside her, "you are not like the other young ladies here tonight." "Is that a compliment, Your Grace, or an accusation?" Arya asked, her voice imbued with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "Most definitely a compliment. They speak of fashion, of gossip, of titles. In the 5 minutes we have been acquainted, you have spoken of honesty. Tell me, what do you enjoy speaking of?" And so, she told him, she spoke of the books she read in secret, of her fascination with the burgeoning science of botany, of her belief that a person's character was more important than their pedigree. David listened, truly listened, with an attentiveness that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world. He, in turn, spoke of the crushing weight of his duties, his frustration with the sycophants who surrounded him, and his secret passion for restoring old clocks, a task that required precision and patience. In that short space of time, they were not a duke and a mysterious stranger. They were simply David and Arya, two people who had found a rare and unexpected connection. Arya felt her borrowed time slipping away like sand through her fingers. Every minute here with him was a minute closer to discovery and disaster. I must be going," she said, her voice laced with regret. "Thank you for the fresh air, Your Grace." "So soon?" David asked, his expression falling. "The night is still young. I haven't even had the chance to ask you for a dance." His eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw a genuine disappointment that made her heart ache. "At the very least you must tell me your full name, and where you are staying. I must be able to call on you." Panic seized her. To give him her name, her address, would be to invite catastrophe. It would lead him directly to the Ainsworths, to Beatrice. The beautiful fantasy would shatter. "I cannot," she whispered, turning to leave. But it was too late. "There you are, you little thief!" The voice was like a whip crack in the serene night. Beatrice stood in the doorway to the terrace, her face a mask of incandescent rage. She was flanked by two of her equally venomous friends, their eyes gleaming with malicious delight at the unfolding drama. "Cousin, please," Arya began, her blood running cold. "Cousin?" Beatrice let out a shrill, mocking laugh that echoed across the stone. "Do not dare to call me that. You are nothing but a charity case, A servant who has stolen a gown and snuck into a party where you are not wanted. She advanced on Arya, her eyes raking over the midnight blue dress with contempt. And that dress! I know that faded old thing. It was my aunt's. You have no right to wear it. You have no right to be here. Her words were loud, designed to carry. Guests began to spill out from the ballroom, drawn by the commotion. A circle of spectators was forming, their faces a mixture of shock and cruel anticipation. Arya stood frozen, pinned by 100 pairs of eyes, her dream turning into a public nightmare. "Lady Beatrice, that is quite enough," David said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low temperature. He moved to stand slightly in front of Arya, a protective gesture that only enraged Beatrice further. "Your Grace, you do not understand," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at Arya. "This is Miss Arya Vance, my penniless cousin who lives on our charity. She is a nobody, a manipulative little creature who has clearly lied to you about who she is." To punctuate her vicious declaration, Beatrice lunged forward. She grabbed the delicate embroidered bodice of Arya's gown. With a sharp, tearing sound, the aged silk gave way. A long, ugly rip appeared, exposing the simple chemise underneath. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Tears of pure humiliation stung Arya's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin, her back ramrod straight, and met Beatrice's triumphant, hateful gaze with one of quiet, unbroken dignity. She would not give her the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The Duke's face had become a thundercloud of controlled fury. He looked from the torn dress to Arya's defiant, pale face, and in that moment he saw everything. He saw the cruelty she must have endured, the strength it took for her to even be here, the courage she was showing now. Without another word, he shrugged off his own exquisitely tailored tailcoat. With a gesture of profound and public significance, he wrapped it around Arya's shoulders, shielding the torn gown and her exposed chemise from the leering eyes of the ton. "The evening has grown cold," he announced to the stunned audience, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced every whisper. Miss Vance was feeling unwell. "I am escorting her home." He offered his arm to Arya. Ignoring the gasps of disbelief, ignoring Beatrice's sputtering, apoplectic face, Arya placed her hand on his arm. As he led her through the gawking crowd, which parted for them as if for royalty, he leaned in and whispered, his voice for her ears alone. "Do not worry, Miss Vance. This is not the end. This is the beginning." The carriage ride back to Grosvenor Square was a silent, tense affair. Arya was wrapped in the Duke's coat, the fine wool still warm from his body and smelling faintly of sandalwood and expensive cigars. She was numb with shock and shame, the sound of tearing silk replaying over and over in her mind. She had flown too close to the sun, and her borrowed wings had been ripped from her in the most brutal way imaginable. David sat opposite her, his jaw tight, his hands clasped over a silver-handled cane. He did not press her for details. He simply watched her, his expression a mixture of anger and a surprising gentleness. When the carriage stopped a block away from the Ainsworth residence, at her quiet request, she handed him back his coat. "Thank you, Your Grace." "For your kindness," she said, her voice barely audible. She couldn't meet his eyes. "David," he corrected her softly. "My name is David, and this is not finished." Before she could protest, he took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I will call on you tomorrow at 2:00. "You mustn't," she pleaded, finally looking up at him, her eyes wide with panic. "You don't understand. My uncle, my cousin, they will make my life unbearable." "Let them try," he said, his voice a low growl of promise. "I will see you at 2." He closed the carriage door, and she was left standing on the cold pavement, clutching the shreds of her magical evening. She crept back into the house through the servants' entrance, where a frantic Mrs. Gable was waiting. The housekeeper's face fell when she saw the torn gown and Aria's stricken expression. There were no words of comfort sufficient for the disaster. The following morning was hell. Lord and Lady Ainsworth, having been informed by a hysterical Beatrice of the night's events, summoned Aria to the study. It was a brutal interrogation. She was accused of being a thief, a liar, and a wanton seductress who had purposefully tried to entrap the Duke to bring shame upon their family. "You have disgraced this house, Aria," her uncle boomed, his face purple with rage. "To think we took you in, gave you a home, and this is how you repay us? By making a spectacle of yourself and humiliating Beatrice?" "You are confined to your room," Lady Ainsworth declared, her voice like ice. "You will have your meals there. You will not leave it until we decide what is to be done with you. We are already looking into a position for you as a governess. Somewhere far away. In the north, perhaps?" Aria accepted her sentence with the same quiet dignity she had shown on the terrace. She did not argue or weep. She simply nodded and returned to her small, plain room, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. A governess in the north. It was a life sentence of obscurity. The Duke's promise to call felt like a fever dream, a fantasy that would never materialize in the harsh light of day. At precisely 2:00, a sharp knock echoed through the townhouse. The butler, his face pale with shock, entered the drawing-room where Lady Ainsworth and Beatrice were dissecting the previous night's gossip. "His Grace, the Duke of Beaumont, is here," the butler announced, his voice trembling. "He is asking to see Miss Aria Vance." Beatrice's teacup clattered into its saucer. Lady Ainsworth's mouth fell open. They had assumed the Duke's actions were a moment of misguided pity, a gesture he would regret by morning. They never imagined he would follow through. "Show him in," Lady Ainsworth managed, scrambling to compose herself. "Beatrice, for heaven's sake, stop looking like a gaping fish." David entered the room, his presence seeming to diminish its opulent furnishings. He was impeccably dressed, radiating an aura of power and absolute self-assurance. He gave Lady Ainsworth and Beatrice a nod so curt it was almost an insult. "I am here to see Miss Vance," he stated, not as a request, but as a fact. "I am afraid Aria is indisposed," Lady Ainsworth said, attempting a sickly sweet smile. "A sudden headache. She is resting." "Then I will wait," David said, remaining standing. The silence that followed was thick with tension. He was not going to be dismissed. Finally, defeated, Lady Ainsworth sent a maid to fetch Aria. When Aria entered the room, she looked pale and worn, dressed again in her simple grey frock. But when her eyes met David's, a flicker of hope ignited within her. He had come. He had actually come. His gaze softened as he looked at her, taking in her subdued appearance. Then he turned his attention back to Lady Ainsworth. "I have come to invite your niece for a drive through the park. My carriage is waiting." This was more than a social call. It was a public declaration. A drive in Hyde Park at the fashionable hour was a clear and unambiguous sign of a duke's interest. It would be seen by everyone. "That is quite impossible," Beatrice blurted out, her jealousy overcoming her manners. "She has duties to attend to." David's gaze settled on Beatrice, and it was so cold she physically recoiled. "I was not aware," he said, his voice dangerously smooth, "that I required your permission." He turned back to Aria, offering his arm. "Miss Vance, shall we?" For the second time in less than 24 hours, Aria was faced with a choice: retreat into the shadows of her miserable life, or take a terrifying leap of faith. She looked at her furious aunt and her seething cousin, and then she looked at the powerful duke who had defended her, who had sought her out, who was now offering her a public alliance. She lifted her chin, walked past her speechless relatives, and placed her hand on his arm. "I would be delighted, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady. As they walked out into the bright afternoon sun, leaving the suffocating darkness of the Ainsworth house behind, Arya knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The entire world of London society was about to be turned on its head. The drive in Hyde Park was a sensation. Heads turned, conversations stopped, and lorgnettes were raised in unison as the Duke of Beaumont's gleaming black carriage, drawn by two magnificent bay horses, rolled along the Serpentine. Seated beside him, looking poised and elegant despite her simple dress, was the unknown Miss Vance. David made a point of greeting acquaintances, introducing Arya with a pointed respect that dared anyone to question her presence at his side. The gossip spread through the ton like wildfire. The Duke, the untouchable Duke, was courting a nobody. This public display marked the beginning of a quiet, determined courtship. David did not shower Arya with extravagant gifts or declarations. Instead, he gave her something far more valuable: his time and his respect. He took her to Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, to the National Gallery, to quiet tea rooms where they could talk for hours without interruption. He discovered the breadth of her intellect, her wry sense of humor, and the deep well of kindness she possessed despite the cruelty she had endured. He found himself falling, not for a potential duchess, but for Arya herself. Arya, in turn, began to blossom under his attention. The timid, downtrodden girl started to fade, replaced by a confident young woman who was unafraid to voice her opinions and share her dreams. She found in David not a formidable duke, but a man who was lonely, burdened by duty, and who possessed a surprisingly gentle heart. She was falling deeply, irrevocably in love. But their burgeoning happiness did not go unchallenged. A vicious campaign of whispers began, orchestrated by the humiliated and vengeful Ainsworths. Lady Ainsworth and Beatrice moved through the drawing rooms and salons of Mayfair like twin spectres, poisoning every well. "She's a cunning little opportunist," Beatrice would hiss to a circle of rapt listeners. "She threw herself at the Duke, you know." My mother and father were horrified. Her own mother, Annalise, was much the same, ran off with some penniless tutor. Bad blood, you see. It always tells. The rumours grew more sordid and elaborate with each telling. Arya was a fortune hunter. She had a scandalous past in the countryside. She was manipulating the Duke, perhaps even blackmailing him. The attacks were insidious, designed to chip away at her reputation and paint her as utterly unsuitable for the station of Duchess. The most formidable opposition, however, came from within Beaumont House itself. The Duchess Dowager, Isabella Beaumont, was a woman forged from iron and aristocratic pride. She had devoted her life to the preservation of the Beaumont name and lineage. The news of her son's infatuation with a girl of no fortune, no connections, and a burgeoning bad reputation was, to her, an existential threat. She summoned David to her private parlour, a room that had witnessed generations of family crises. "I have heard the most disturbing things, David," she began, her voice devoid of warmth. "A Miss Vance. They say she is the niece of that dreadful parvenu Ainsworth. They say she is a conniving little nobody who staged a scene at your ball to entrap you." "They are lies, Mother," David said, his voice calm but firm, "spread by people whose envy has curdled into malice." "Reputation is not about truth, it is about perception," the Duchess retorted, striking the arm of her chair with a gloved hand. "You are the Duke of Beaumont. You will not, you cannot attach yourself to a girl like this. You will end it. It is an embarrassment to our name." "I will do no such thing," David stated, his resolve hardening. "I have found, for the first time in my life, a woman of substance and character, a woman I admire. I will not forsake her because of the malicious gossip of fools." "Then you will find yourself in opposition to me," the Duchess declared, her eyes like chips of ice. "I will not stand by and watch you destroy centuries of breeding and prestige for a pretty face and a sob story. You will choose, David, your duty or this girl." The battle lines were drawn. Arya found herself isolated, the target of cold shoulders and veiled insults wherever she went. The only person she could count on was David, but she saw the strain the conflict was putting on him. The pressure from his mother was immense, and the public scrutiny was relentless. Doubt began to creep into her heart. Was she being selfish? Was she going to be the cause of a permanent rift between David and his mother? The ruin of his reputation? The situation escalated when Lord Percival Finch, a notorious rake and a rival of David's, saw an opportunity. He cornered Arya one afternoon as she was leaving the bookshop. "Miss Vance," he said, his smile predatory. "You've certainly caused a stir, but you and I both know this little fairy tale has an ending. Beaumont will tire of his novelty. When he does, a girl like you will need a protector." He reached out and touched a stray curl on her neck. "A man like me can be very generous." Arya slapped his hand away, her eyes flashing with anger. "Do not ever touch me, my lord, or speak to me again." She walked away, trembling with rage and fear. The threat was clear. The world saw her as a plaything, a pawn. As she hurried down the street, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps a girl with nothing but a borrowed gown and a stolen dream had no place in this world after all. The relentless pressure was beginning to take its toll. Arya grew withdrawn, the light in her eyes dimming with each fresh insult and cold shoulder she endured. She loved David with all her heart, but she loved him enough to wonder if letting him go was the kindest thing she could do for him. To be with her was to invite scandal and familial war. How could she ask him to pay such a price? David, meanwhile, was not idle. He was a man of action, a strategist who managed vast estates and navigated the treacherous waters of Parliament. He would not allow the woman he loved to be destroyed by lies. He set his personal solicitor, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient man named Mr. Davies, to the task of quashing the rumors. But to do so, they needed to fight lies with truth. They needed to know everything about Arya Vance. "I want you to investigate her past," David instructed him, "not because I doubt her, but because I must be armed to defend her. The Ainsworths claim her father was a penniless tutor and her mother a disgrace. I want to know the truth of it. Find out who they were, Robert and Annalise Vance." As Mr. Davies began his quiet investigation, David focused on restoring Arya's spirit. He arrived at the Ainsworth house one afternoon to find her in the small, neglected garden, her hands twisting in her lap, her face etched with misery. He sat beside her on the cold stone bench. "They are getting to you," he said softly. It was not a question. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Perhaps they are right, David. Perhaps I don't belong in your world. The only world I care about is the one that has you in it," he said fiercely, taking her hands in his. "Do not let them win, Arya. Do not let their bitterness extinguish your light." He paused, his expression softening. "I have a request. It may seem odd." "Anything," she whispered. "The gown you wore to my ball, your mother's gown. Where is it?" "It's in my room." Mrs. Gable helped me mend the tear, but it's just put away." "May I see it?" Puzzled, Arya led him upstairs to her small room. She retrieved the dress from its protective bag and laid it carefully on the bed. The midnight blue silk seemed to glow in the afternoon light. David looked at it not as a piece of clothing, but as a clue. He ran his fingers gently over the repaired bodice, his touch light and reverent. He felt the fine silver embroidery, the tiny, intricate stitches forming the patterns like constellations. His eyes traced the pattern, and then he stopped. Near the hem, almost hidden in the folds of the heavy silk, was a small, exquisitely stitched emblem. It was no bigger than a shilling, a detail one would never notice unless they were searching for it. It was a crest, a silver falcon, its wings outstretched, perched atop a coronet. David stared at it, his mind racing. He had seen that crest before. It was ancient, noble, and belonged to one of the oldest and most respected families in the kingdom. "Arya," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Did your mother ever speak of her family? Before she married your father?" Arya shook her head. "Very little. Only that they did not approve of my father. He was a scholar, a man of intellect, but no title. She chose to leave her world behind for him. I always assumed. Beatrice always said they were minor gentry, insignificant." "They were not insignificant," David said, his gaze locked on the tiny embroidered falcon. "This crest. This is the crest of the House of Pembroke." The name hung in the air. The Earl of Pembroke was a legendary figure, immensely wealthy and powerful, a recluse who had lived in self-imposed exile at his remote castle in Wales for nearly 2 decades. It was said he had a daughter, his only child, who had broken his heart and been disowned. Just then, a footman appeared at the door with an urgent message. It was from Mr. Davies. David tore it open and read it, his eyes widening with every word. The solicitor's report confirmed his suspicion. Lady Annalise Vance had indeed been Lady Annalise Fitzwilliam, the sole heir of the Earl of Pembroke. She had been disowned for eloping with a brilliant Oxford scholar, Robert Vance. The Earl had cut her off completely, and she had died years later, without ever reconciling with her father. David looked from the letter to Arya, who was watching him with a bewildered expression. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with stunning clarity. Arya Vance was not a penniless nobody. She was the granddaughter, and, now that her mother was gone, the sole living heir of the Earl of Pembroke. Her blood was as blue, if not bluer, than his own. The gown was not just a dress. It was a legacy. The dress her mother had worn to elope, a symbol of her choice, but she had still stitched her family's crest into it, a tiny secret reminder of who she was. A slow smile spread across David's face. He loved her for being Arya Vance, the kind, intelligent, resilient woman he had met by the ferns. But he would not hesitate to use the power of Lady Arya Fitzwilliam to protect her. He kept the information to himself, holding the trump card close to his chest. His mother was planning a grand dinner party, a final, public attempt to force David's hand and display the unsuitability of his chosen partner. He knew it was meant to be an ambush, and he knew now, with absolute certainty, how he would turn their weapons back on them. "Arya," he said, his voice full of a new, triumphant energy. "I would be honored if you would accompany me to my mother's dinner party next week, and I would very much like it if you would wear this gown." The night of the Duchess Dowager's dinner party arrived, thick with anticipation and unspoken menace. It was, as David had predicted, a carefully orchestrated ambush. The guest list was a collection of the Tun's most influential gossips and society's strictest gatekeepers. And seated in places of honor were Lady Ainsworth, Beatrice, and the predatory Lord Percival Finch. Arya entered the grand dining room on David's arm. A hush fell over the assembly. She was wearing the mended midnight blue gown. It looked even more stunning than it had at the ball, its simple elegance a quiet rebuke to the glittering jewels and flamboyant silks surrounding her. She held her head high, her expression calm and composed, but her hand trembled slightly on David's arm. He gave it a reassuring squeeze. He had told her nothing of his discovery, only that she must trust him completely. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Duchess was icily polite, her every word a thinly veiled jab at Arya's origins. Lady Ainsworth and Beatrice supplied the ammunition, telling thinly disguised anecdotes about the folly of marrying beneath one's station. Lord Percival Finch stared at Arya with a proprietary smirk, as if he were merely waiting for David to discard her. Finally, as the main course was cleared, the Duchess made her move. "Tell me, Miss Vance," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the table. "David is so taken with you, yet we know so little of your family. Lady Ainsworth tells me your father was a teacher of some sort." The condescension in her tone was palpable. "He was a scholar," Arya replied, her voice steady. "A brilliant man who valued knowledge above all else." "How quaint," Beatrice sneered from across the table. "And your mother? She was disowned for marrying him, wasn't she? Cast out by her family for such a foolish, impulsive match." The trap was sprung. The table waited, hungry for Arya's humiliation. This was the moment she was supposed to crumble, to be exposed as the descendant of nobodies and social outcasts. But before Arya could respond, David stood up. He placed his napkin calmly on the table, his commanding presence drawing every eye. "My mother is correct," he began, his voice ringing with authority. "We should speak of Miss Vance's family. It is a topic of great importance." He looked at Beatrice. "You are also correct, Lady Beatrice. Miss Vance's mother, Lady Annalise, was indeed disowned for her choice of husband. Her family didn't approve." He paused, letting the tension build. "However, you seem to be under a misapprehension as to who that family was. She was not cast out by minor gentry. She was cast out by her father, one of the most powerful men in this country, a man who has regretted his decision every day for the last 20 years. David turned his gaze to Arya, his eyes full of love and pride. "The woman you have been so eager to insult is not merely Arya Vance. She is the granddaughter and sole heir of William Fitzwilliam, the Earl of Pembroke." A collective, audible gasp went through the room. Silverware clattered. The Duchess Dowager's face went white with shock. Beatrice and her mother looked as though they had been struck by lightning, their faces a comical mask of horror and disbelief. That's impossible. It's a lie," Beatrice stammered. "Is it?" David retorted, his voice like steel. He gestured to Arya's gown. "The proof has been before you all this time. Perhaps, if you looked more closely at the fine things you claim to value, you would have noticed the Pembroke crest, the silver falcon, stitched into the hem of this very gown." Just as he spoke, the grand doors to the dining room swung open. The butler, his face awestruck, announced, "His Lordship, the Earl of Pembroke." An old man stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane, but with eyes that burned with a fierce intensity. He was frail, but his aristocratic bearing was unmistakable. His gaze swept the room until it landed on Arya. Tears welled in his eyes. "Annalise," he whispered, the name a breath of old grief. "No, you have her eyes." He had been contacted by David's solicitor that very morning, provided with incontrovertible proof that his long-lost granddaughter had been found. He had travelled from Wales without stopping. He walked slowly, unsteadily, across the room, his eyes never leaving Arya's face. He stopped before her and reached out a trembling hand. "I have spent years searching for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was a proud, foolish old man. I drove away my only child. Can you ever forgive me?" Tears streamed down Arya's face as she stood and took his hand. All the years of loneliness, of feeling adrift and unconnected, melted away. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered. The Earl embraced his granddaughter, a lifetime of regret and love pouring into the gesture. He then turned his cold, furious gaze upon the Ainsworths. "And you," he rasped, his voice suddenly powerful, "you are the ones who took in my blood, my only family, and treated her as a scullery maid. You will find that the name Pembroke carries weight. You will be ruined. You will be shunned by every decent family in this city." Beatrice and her mother looked utterly destroyed. Lord Percival Finch quietly tried to slip away, but David's voice stopped him. "Leaving so soon, Finch? I believe you owe my fiancé an apology." Fiancé. The word hung in the stunned silence. David turned away from the chaos and knelt on one knee before Arya, who was still standing beside her grandfather. He took her hand, ignoring the shocked gasps of everyone present. "Arya Vance," he said, his voice full of a love that was plain for all to see. "I fell in love with you when I thought you were a mysterious stranger in a borrowed gown. I don't care if you are a Vance or a Fitzwilliam, a commoner or the heir to an earldom. I only care that you are the most intelligent, courageous, and wonderful woman I have ever known. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, my duchess, my everything?" Through her happy tears, Arya smiled. Her life had been a story of loss and shadows, but this man had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. "Yes, David," she said, her voice ringing with joy. "Yes, I will." The last laugh did not belong to the gossips or the schemers. It belonged to the girl in the borrowed gown who had not only captured the Duke's eyes, but had captured his heart, and in doing so, had found her own destiny. And so, Arya's story wasn't just about a magical night at a ball. It was a testament to the enduring power of inner strength and the truth that a person's worth is not defined by their circumstances, but by their character. She entered Beaumont House as a whisper and left it as a roar. Her marriage to Duke David Beaumont wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of a true partnership built on respect, admiration, and a love that had been tested by scandal and proven by devotion. The Ainsworths faded into social obscurity, a bitter lesson in cruelty, while Arya, with her grandfather by her side and her loving husband, became one of the most beloved duchesses in history, known for her intelligence, her kindness, and for always remembering the girl she once was. What do you think of Arya's incredible journey? Have you ever felt underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your own stories of triumph in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And if you enjoyed this story of romance, drama, and sweet revenge, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with a friend who loves a good story, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that will capture your heart. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.